Hello, everyone. This is the 133rd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Mr. Karan Tejwani as we discuss his book, The Thinker's Factory: How Italian Coaching Conquered the World. Mr. Tejwani is an author, freelance journalist, and a lecturer. He has written for the likes of The Guardian, BBC Sport, and These Football Times, among others. His other books include Wings of Change, How the World's Biggest Energy Drinks Manufacturer Made a Mark in Football, as well as Glorious Reinvention, The Rebirth of Ajax Amsterdam. Mr. Tejwani is also the administrator of the website Football Chronicle. Hello, Karan. Welcome.
Thank you, Sean. It's very kind of you to say. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Firstly, very kind of you to say thank you very much. And thanks for having me on. I'm a fan of football, I think, as most people are, as most journalists tend to be, as most people working in football tend to be, really. I started off watching when I was very young, 5, 6 years old, immediately caught my eye. My family, not so much into football. It was kind of weird that I chose to have a career in football itself and a career in sport. But yeah, I think you've covered most of what I would have said anyways. But I've been a journalist since 2016, which is almost 9 years now. I've been very fortunate to work with the people I've been able to work with. I've been very fortunate to work with the people that are in massive global organizations, which I'm very grateful for. And I've been an author for 4 and a bit years now. So as you mentioned, 3 books before, all covering different aspects of European football. And yeah, my latest book was The Thinker's Factory, which came out last month. And I was quite pleased with that at the end.
What was the trigger to write about this topic of this Italian coaching philosophy?
Italian coaching has been, and Italian success has always been an ever-present in my life. I've watched football for, 16 years now, 15 years. And ever since I started off watching football, Italian coaches have always been quite successful. The first World Cup I watched was 2006. Obviously, Italy won that World Cup. One of the first few Champions League memories I can remember, although I didn't know at the time, was Milan winning the Champions League 2007, again, led by an Italian coach. I still do watch a lot of Premier League football, and the Premier League has obviously had a lot of coaches through its history. You start off with Ancelotti at Chelsea, Mancini at Man City, Ranieri, Conte at Leicester and Chelsea, Di Matteo even, regardless of how short his stint was, in the Champions League one. So it's been an ever-present. And in 2019, I wrote a piece for These Football Times about Coverciano, the sort of coaching school for all of these great coaches in Italy. And my fascination for Italian coaching carried on since then. It was very fascinating to me how essentially one school builds up and elevates all these coaching talents and makes them coaches in the modern era. And I'm sure we'll touch on it later on in the podcast, but Coverciano's success and the fascination I had since sort of inspired me to carry on this. And even the name of the book, called Thinker's Factory, the editor of These Football Times at the time, almost Liam, and he still is, labeled the headline of the piece that I wrote for These Football Times as The Thinker's Factory. And I felt it was appropriate that the book was called The Thinker's Factory, because Italian football and Italy itself is a thinker's factory.
Your book covers nearly a century of football history, in fact, maybe more. What was your research process like and the duration to write this book?
It was the most challenging piece of football writing I've ever done in my life, without a doubt, mainly because, as you mentioned, it goes back over a century. It goes back to around World War I time, and that was the time period I wanted to cover, so essentially the last 100 years or so, and look at Italy from a post-World War I perspective and how it changed. Italy itself is obviously very historical, has a massive saying in football, and has massive contribution to Europe itself beyond football itself. So I think wanting to cover that was a very important thing for me. I felt it would have been unfair if I didn't touch on the 1920s and 1930s, because obviously they won the World Cup twice in that era. They were massive in the Olympics and the Intercontinental Cup at the time. So it was quite important for me to cover that era, and it would have been a massive injustice if I hadn't. And in terms of research, as you mentioned, it was challenging, mainly because it's difficult to find information and people to talk to with regards to football 100 years ago. There's a very great blog on the internet called the Football and War Network, which covers football during the wartime. It mainly covers football in that era in England, but it also has historians working with it that covered Italian football and football from other countries in Europe. So talking to people from there was a very big step right at the start. And I'm sure, again, we'll touch on it later on, but there's a chapter in the book very early on about how countries like Hungary and Austria and Czechoslovakia contributed to Italian success. And learning about that was very fascinating. And it sort of helped shape up what Italian football is today. And again, as with all modern European football, a lot of it links back to things that were done 50, 60, maybe 100 years ago. And it's the same for Italy.
So let's start off from the beginning. Like many nations, Italy's football origins and legacy of tactics can be traced back to the British influence with workers in the late 19th century and early 20th century, expatriates, etc. Now, this later in the 20s and 30s, as you mentioned, there's the influence of the Danubian school of the Hungarians and Austrians and Czechs. Well, let's start with the British influence, and how did this later influence of the Danubian school, how did they differ?
The British obviously came in first, and they sort of exported their football into various European nations. It's not just in Italy, you can see it in Spain as well, with clubs like Barcelona, who have been inspired or sort of even co-founded by English/Irish/British people. And they've all had a big say in how current European powerhouses in football started off in their journey as football clubs. You see it in so many Italian clubs right now, clubs like Milan, Genoa, others that have the St. George's Cross on their crest because that's a homage to their English history or their British history. And as you mentioned before, a lot of these expatriates who were living in England, who worked either as ship merchants or sellers or worked in ports, came over to England, started playing football, and decided to form their own football clubs. They didn't always start as football clubs, as it's pretty well known. Milan, for example, were a cricket club as well as a football club at the start, and it's the same for many other clubs across Italy. But they essentially exported their football from England to Italy, and that sort of, it didn't professionalize it, but it gave Italy a standing in football. Again, at the time, the 1920s, 1930s, there were different sports that Italy did prefer or did like. Things like cycling and swimming, those individual sports sort of got a fair bit of attention. But football was probably the first team sport that sort of gained attention. And the English did have a big part to play in it. Whilst Italy were having a fair bit of history, England were making it better. English coaches came from abroad. People that worked at clubs like Liverpool and Everton came over to Italy and sort of displayed their skills and displayed how they could be more professional. They didn't take them to a very professional level, but they sort of improved the level Italy was at as a football country. Things like training better or, sleeping well and eating well in order to be prepared for a game. Things like that were a lot more professionalized in that sense. People like William Garbett, who was the first true Mista of Italian coaching, who was the first true Italian great coach to have worked in Italy, came over from England to Italy, worked at clubs across the country, sort of professionalized how they were training, how they were working, and he inspired a whole host of people to come over to Italy and find their way in the Italian game.
As far as the Danubian influence, you mentioned that they mainly tightened Italy's defenses.
The Danubians is, essentially for people that aren't entirely aware of the term, it's people that came over from Austria or Hungary or Czechoslovakia or around that area after World War I. Many of them displaced after the war, and many of them went to countries across Europe, namely places like Spain, France, and many of them came to Italy as well in the 1920s. And they were inspired by the British, essentially, to sort of take on football as well. Many of them started playing in the country because they found it as a way to sort of integrate into society, get on with Italian culture because football was such a growing sport at the time. And they found their home in the country. You'll even see, if you go back to statistics, there were about 80 odd or 90 odd players playing at the top levels in Italy. And that sort of inspired them to take the game to a high level. Many people found that they had a variety of skills, that they were more persistent. As you mentioned before, a lot of them were fascinated by defending. And that sort of shaped up modern Italian football is. There's often a sort of stereotype nowadays that Italian football is very defensive. And to an extent, it was very true. And you can pin it on the 1960s when Nelly Rocco came on. But it was with the 1920s when the English and the British and the Danubians mixed up and sort of made the Italian game or sort of laid the foundations for what the Italian game would become. And it was a big part of Italy's football history. And again, I've mentioned a lot of this in the book itself, where because of the ban on foreign players in the mid-1920s, there was a huge dent to that sort of Italian football. And then the local regime, led by Mussolini and his people, wanted to professionalize Italian sport more and wanted to have fewer foreigners in their game. It did have a big effect on Italian football, but by then the influence was already clear, and there was a big impact of what these people from abroad did in the Italian game.
For anyone who may not know, can you discuss the differences between the main tactical systems of the day, the metodo versus the sistema?
So this is obviously a very long description, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible, whilst just trying to be as simplistic as possible. So the metodo essentially is a formation that's a 2-3-2-3. If you can imagine that in your head, it's two inverted W's, which essentially has three forwards at top, which is obviously as now known as two wingers and a forward, and two fullbacks and three halfbacks. Sorry, it's a lot of numbers, but essentially a 2-3-2-3 formation. And a lot of it was devised by what the English came and did first. So a lot of English coaches came in from obviously England, and they sort of devised a system because that was what was popular in Italy at the time. It was heavily influenced by what England played at the time, which was the WM formation, which is quite similar. But what was different was that because it was more defensively minded and more defensive based, they had a lot more defensive strength. They felt they had more control in midfield, and they felt their forwards could sort of switch around quite easily and play in multiple positions. Over time, its success changed. Vittorio Pozzo, the coach that won the World Cup twice for Italy, was the first sort of great Italian coach to employ that system in Italian football. Similarly, the Sistema is a similar formation, but it's slightly more attack-minded, and it came over in Italy towards the end of the 1930s, because that's when people started to feel the Metodo was drying out in a way. It was quite easy to counter in a way. That's when the Sistema came up, which is, again, quite similar in terms of numbers. It was three defenders, two midfielders, two attacking midfielders in a way, and three forwards. Again, it had similar principles of staying solid defensively, but it involved a lot more running for the attacking players to sort of make up ground, to sort of play in positions that they were used to and sort of maintain more solidity. Again, people that came in from abroad employed this. Vittorio Pozzo tried to employ this, but although he was traditionally known to be the best coach for the Metodo, he struggled with it, and that eventually led to his downfall as an Italy coach. So after the World Cup win of 1938, he was still in the job after World War II, but it was clear that the Metodo was no longer going to work because, firstly, Italian coaches were better than him at doing it, and secondly, foreign coaches made it clear that the Metodo was sort of dying out, and it was an ancient, in a way, system that would no longer work. So that was a pretty clear strategy, and the first great team to play the Sistema was the Torino sides of the 1940s. I'm sure everybody knows the history of them, but the Torino teams of the 1940s sort of made the Sistema what it was, which was a successful formation for great attacking teams. At the time, Torino were undoubtedly the greatest Italian team until that era of Italian football. How far they could have gone, nobody will know, but it's clear that they were the first truly great Italian team to make a mark on international football in a way. But yeah, that was those 2 decades between the 1930s and the 1950s was the first great tactical era in Italian football where so much changed, and it sort of laid the foundations for a very successful future in Italian football.
We come to the 1950s, and you already touched upon it. The most important development in this decade is the construction of the Coverciano Center. Can you explain the importance of this?
So the Coverciano Center is, I'm sure people who have an eye on Italian football are aware that it's the center where Italian coaches are trained. It's the center where the Italian national team is based, where they train and they stay during national team breaks. But in greater sense, it's the center where Italian coaches sort of hone their skills in a way. It came up in the 1950s by a person named Luigi Ridolfi, who was himself a keen sports fan and a sports person in the past. And his idea was to form a center of excellence where he wanted the best skills to be highlighted. He wanted more professionalism in the sport. And this was a time where, again, it's worth mentioning that Italian football was struggling at the time. It was after World War II. The country itself was in massive economic crisis because of the damage done after the war and the reparations and the struggles they were facing. The economy was poor. The people were struggling. but sport was still going quite strong.
Also, the national team was at a weak point because of the
Yep.
Superga tragedy. The national team was decimated. So
Yes.
during this decade, it's fair to say the national team is struggling while this
Yes.
Coverciano Center is being built.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, in 1950, I believe, again, because the Superga tragedy was the year before, in the 1950 World Cup, they sent out the weakest team. Well, people believed it's the weakest team, the weakest Italian team to play at a men's World Cup. And people wanted that to change. Despite Italian football still going through the war, the National League was going on, clubs were still functioning, if not successful. They felt that the coaching side of things could change. And that's when Ridolfi came up with the idea of forming a national centre. And it was born. It was born with the idea of excellence. It was born with the idea of incorporating different sports, not just football initially. And eventually it became what is now the Italian coaching school. Fast forward many decades, it's now the place where every Italian coach has to study for some time to gain their coaching license, or the UEFA Pro license, which is the highest requirement you are required to get before coaching a professional men's game. And you think of every great Italian coach, they've almost definitely been there and studied there. The most fascinating part, what I find personally, is the thesis, which is called Il Master, which is essentially a dissertation for coaches in order to pass their course. In the book, I've mentioned many examples, but some examples particularly stick out. Maurizio Sarri, for example, the former Chelsea and Lazio coach and Napoli coach, who wrote about the preparation before a match day. He wrote about his detailed week before the match day and how he prepares for a game in the days leading up to it. Antonio Conte, I believe, if I'm not wrong, wrote about the 4-3-1-2 formation and how it provides more defensive solidity. He, of course, employed those formations at various clubs through his career. Roberto Mancini, himself a good attacking player, wrote about the importance of the number 10. And there's various examples, so I can't remember off the top of my head. But some of these are available to read online, and it's quite easy to find, actually. But it's a very fascinating football school in a way, and if people have the chance, I'd recommend seeing and reading as much about it as they can. There's a lot of open websites and blogs that talk about it, and lots of videos as well where you can see what these coaches are up to and how they're taught. It's a very fascinating piece of football history in a way.
The 1960s is the age of Catenaccio, that of Helenio Herrera at Inter and Nereo Rocco at AC Milan. They say success has many fathers, and according to your book, many claim credit for this tactic. Can you discuss the evolution of this tactic that would become synonymous with Italian culture?
I'm sure just about every football fan's heard the term catenaccio at least once in their lives, but there's a very potted history about how it started off. A lot of people claim to have started off. There was one story where Karl Rappan, a former Austrian coach who used to work in Switzerland, formed the theory while he was on a fishing boat. I believe it is, if that's the right story. He formed the foundations of the system whilst on a fishing boat and whilst he was fishing, because he had two nets, the first net to catch the fish and the second net to sort of catch any fish that was straying out of the net. He claims he founded it first, or he saw it first, and he got the idea first. In Italy, people like Giuseppe Viani say he saw it first and that he employed it first in his team. But there's no clear identification of who started it off first. But Viani in Italy at least claims that, and he has the strongest claim to it because he was leading a lot of teams at the time, and they sort of employed versions of the catenaccio formation system. Sorry, but it really started to get a hold of Italian football in the 1950s. Alfredo Forni, the former Inter coach, employed a sort of version of it in the 50s, and as you mentioned before, it sort of came to be in the 1960s where Elenio Herrera, who was renowned for his sort of defensive acumen, employed at Inter, and they were quite successful. Again, essentially for people that aren't entirely aware, it's essentially a formation to sort of bolt up the defense. In French, the term comes from dobolt, which I believe is the French translation of it. And again, as the name suggests, it's there to sort of bolt up the defense and provide more solidity. And that's where I believe the stereotype of Italian defending comes through, because of Italian teams having strong defenses and building up stern back lines and being more defensively solid rather than more proactive in their football. But again, there's lots of history behind it. Still unclear who has the first claim over Catenaccio, but it clearly became the thing in Italian football in the 1960s with Milan and Inter and their rivalry. And it stuck on for some decades after that.
For anyone who may not know, essentially you have the libero, the sweeper, who's free of marking any opposition player and is basically just sweeping up the loose balls. And you have
Yep.
a stopper and a left back, right back, man marking. Catenaccio became the fashionable system because of the success of Inter and AC Milan in the Champions Cup.
Yep.
It stuck for decades. In your book, you take time to discuss other managers successful in the 60s through the 1980s who may be overlooked by the casual football fans. These include the likes of Fulvio Bernardini, Bruno Pezzaola, Scopino, and moving into the 80s, you have Osvaldo Bagnoli and Ottavio Bianchi, among others. In a way, their achievements are more noteworthy for winning with so-called smaller teams.
It's a big part of Italian football history. You think of, if you go, for example, ask someone, an average football fan or a football fan, to name Italian coaches in the past, they'd obviously bring up Ancelotti's and Capello's and Rocco's and whatnot. But it's some of these Italian coaches in the 60s and 80s, and particularly the 60s and 80s, that are particularly impressive. And they made their names with teams that aren't traditionally known to be very successful. As you mentioned, Bianchi at Napoli, who won Serie A with Maradona's team, essentially. And obviously, while Maradona claims, well, he didn't claim it, but he's given most of the attribution for the success, and rightly so. It was a lot of Bianchi's work that sort of made them very successful. Even going all the way through to the 90s, where a lot of these people sort of rose up and made their name in Italian football. It's a pretty big deal. If you go back to the 70s, between the 60s and the 80s, there's proper domination from the three big Italian clubs in the game right now, which is Milan, Juventus, and Inter. But a lot of these teams made their name as a result of great coaching. You think of teams like Bologna, Genoa, Roma even. They sort of enhanced their reputation and their history thanks to these coaches and how the game changed over time. Even a great example is Luigi Radice's Torino, who sort of became the first team to sort of sway away from Catenaccio and employ a more proactive style of football. And while they didn't go on to achieve major things, they were still very widely recognized for sort of being more brave in their football and going away from what everyone else was doing. So these people are massive names in Italian football, and they rightly deserve their credit despite not having as much success as some of the more traditional Italian coaches that are held to a greater esteem.
The Italian national team renaissance, you discuss it through Ferruccio Valcareggi's tenure in the late 1960s into the early 70s, and later by Enzo Bearzot and Marcello Lippi, who won the World Cups in 1982 and 2006. How important was their influence in this change of fortune?
Personally, this is one of the more fascinating pieces of history that I covered in the book, especially with Valcareggi, because of, if you look at Italian football at the time, again, while the domestic clubs were succeeding, the national team wasn't quite as successful. They hadn't won the World Cup in about 30 years. They struggled on the world scene and the European scene for quite a while. And obviously the World War played a part, and there wasn't as much unity with the national team. But Valcareggi's team was, or his impact was very, very important towards long-term Italian success in a way. He wasn't meant to be the coach of the national team in a way. He only got the job because you could attribute it to perhaps laziness from the Italian FA. You could perhaps attribute it to a bit of trust. But for context, he was the assistant coach at the 1966 World Cup, and he's widely blamed for them losing to North Korea and sort of being knocked out of the World Cup. And yet he got the job immediately after as a result of it. And he sort of took the team to the next level by having a bit more unity in the side. He's often credited for sort of building more bridges within the team and ensuring they play as a team. And secondly, he's sort of accredited with his tactical acumen. While he wasn't regarded as a great Italian coach or a big legend in the game, he was regarded for how closely bonded his team were to Inter's success and how they played a similar style to Helenio Herrera's success when he was with Inter. And that led to the victory in the European Championship in 1968 and the World Cup final they reached in 1970. Now, the 1970 World Cup is a pretty big deal because they were competing against Brazil in the final, who were the clear favourites because they had players like Pelé, who was playing his final World Cup. but the squad was not expected to get to the World Cup final despite all the talent they had. He also did well to manage the personalities in the squad in a way. He had Gianni Rivera and Sandro Mazzola in the team, both of whom occupied a similar position, and he ensured that they both got enough game time and contributed to the team's success. And that was the big success for the team as they reached the World Cup final, which they weren't expected to. So while he arrived in the squad as a relative unknown, he left as a legend, even though the last 3 or 4 years of his tenure were sort of impacted by relative failures. But he's seen as sort of the turning point in Italian coaching from the national team's perspective. Similar for Biasot, who sort of had his opportunities and grew his way into the game, didn't really have a brilliant coaching career, but he was learning from other great coaches. He worked with Bernardini, he worked with Rocco when he was at Torino, and he was sort of learning his way through the game and eventually got a national team job. And as you mentioned, he won the World Cup in 82 with a much more stronger team. It's easy to say that he had a fairly strong team in 82 that led to the World Cup. He was also in charge of the World Cup team in 78, where he gave opportunities to players like Paolo Rossi and Antonio Cabrini, who were fairly younger at the time. But he was attributed to giving those young players a chance to be a part of the team and then have faith in them to win the World Cup in 82. Again, this is a very untold story in wider Italian context, but the 1982 World Cup, there was, and again, one of my favorite anecdotes from the book is from my research, is that whilst the national team were criticized by the media in 82 because of, firstly, the match fixing controversy in Italian football, and secondly, Paolo Rossi's ban from football for 2 years, Biasot still believed that Rossi was the man while he was banned, and he knew that his ban ended just before the World Cup. So about 6 months before the World Cup started in the winter of 81, he held individual training sessions with him and ensured he was fit in order to play at the World Cup. And at the World Cup, Paolo Rossi was the top scorer, and he ended up in the Ballon d'Or that year, which is a sort of testament. And they also were sort of boycotting talking to Italian media at the time because they felt the team was too critical. So they only allowed Dino Zoff, the goalkeeper and the captain, to speak to the media, one player for the whole team, rather than having a whole full-blown press conference. And after the World Cup, when they won the whole thing, Biasot finally had a press conference with the media for the first time in, I believe, a month or so. One of his last responses were, "Do you not have any more questions?" So as to take a shot at the media for criticizing him and his team throughout the whole tournament. So it's a very fascinating period of Italian football history, and a lot of it is often forgotten, but it's definitely worth getting its credit for its contribution to the Italian game.
We discussed that Italian football was entrenched with Catenaccio, but in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you have what's referred to as La Zona or Zona Mista. And you already mentioned Radice as one of the proponents of this. Can you discuss the evolution and other more famous proponents of this?
Again, as I mentioned, Radice, a big proponent of this, essentially is what is now known as, well, but there's iterations of zonal marking in it. And it was sort of inspired by Ajax of the 1960s and 1970s. After Milan's success in the European Cup in 1969, where they beat Ajax, Dutch football sort of became the higher power in European football. It started off with Feyenoord's European Cup success in 1970, and Ajax won 3 European Cups straight after that. So there was a good half a decade of Dutch football being very successful. And obviously the 2 World Cups where the Dutch team of Johan Cruyff and Ruud Krol and all those legends that reached the World Cup final twice in 2 editions. So Dutch football was the very top of European football. Italy sort of felt they were slacking behind in a way. Again, football evolves, tactical systems evolve, and Italian football had to change because Catenaccio was no longer working, and people recognized that there was a good counter to Catenaccio, and that's when total football came and became what it is now. So around the mid-70s and early 80s, La Zona came about, was Zona Mista, which essentially was a version of zonal marking now. It combines sort of defensive solidity with more freedom, more possession awareness, more recognition of how much space, and more recognition of playing without the ball in order to cover up the space rather than covering up just a man they're marking. As I mentioned, Radice was one of the first proponents. Trapattoni is probably its most popular proponent. When he took over at Juventus in the 70s, we spoke about Enzo Biasot in the World Cup in 82. That's where it was shown on the national stage and sort of carried Italian football through to one of its biggest honors and winning the World Cup. But those 3 were perhaps the biggest influences in that particular system becoming a very successful one. And Trapattoni himself it's strange because he's such a great coach and his record, he's the most successful Serie A coach ever. He's won the European Cup once. He's won every European trophy available to him. He's worked in various countries and been successful everywhere he's been. But his success is sort of forgotten because it happened so long ago, in a way. He won the European Cup in 85. He's been out of the picture for a while, and his later years were sort of unsuccessful in a way. But he was one of the great minds of Italian football, and he still is, in a way. So recognizing that is quite an important part of Italian football history is a huge deal. But yeah, it was a big change that Italian football needed in a way at the time. Again, as I mentioned, football evolves every year, and La Zona was the big evolution that Italy needed at the time.
Arrigo Sacchi's ascent was a revolution in Italian tactics and football culture. Can you explain just how groundbreaking was his influence on the Italian game?
It's again inspired a lot by Ajax. As I mentioned, Ajax and Dutch football was the peak of football when Sacchi would have been growing up. And he sort of went away from the traditional Italian sense of just being purely so defensive. His teams were sort of known for being a big collective, and regardless of the superstars he had, he wanted his team to be united in their sort of work off the ball. They had to be aware of what they were doing, where they were, how to defend, how to counter in a way. And it was inspired again by Ajax, as I mentioned. A lot of it was based on wing play and keeping the ball and being proactive with it, which was traits that you didn't normally associate with Italian football. It's very well known that he was a former shoe salesman who turned into a football coach. His famous quote was that,
He
is that the correct
says,
quote?
yeah, you don't have to be a horse to be a jockey.
There we go. That's the correct quote, which is, again, his most famous saying, or something that became really popular over time. And it worked out well. He was at Parma, as people may know, that he was at Parma. He was working with the Serie B team, and his big moment came when they played Milan in the Coppa Italia, and they won. And Silvio Berlusconi, who was a fairly risk-happy coach who was happy to take challenges on, gave Sacchi the job after being so impressed by what he'd done with Parma, despite having no experience playing football, which was rare at the time. The story is pretty well known after that he was at Milan, won 2 successive European Cups, and for a long time they were the last team to have won 2 successive European Cups, and it became a big deal. Again, although his later years are less renowned, when he was working in Spain and working with the national team, his Milan years were one of the best football teams ever created. There's many people that have said this. I can't remember who said it exactly, but there's always a saying that football existed before Sacchi and after Sacchi, and he sort of changed the game. Even people now like Guardiola, who attributed him to their success, shows just how big his impact was. So Sacchi is one of the game's great coaches, and I think he should be recognized as such.
In the post-Bosman era, into the present time, it was inevitable that Italian managers would join foreign leagues. The likes of Ranieri, Vialli, Ancelotti, Capello, Mancini, and we can go on, Conte, were very much in demand and achieved success. What do you think attracted foreign teams to these Italian managers? Was it the legacy of success or the deep knowledge of the game and tactics?
I think it was a big combination of both, really. The track record was inevitable in a way. Every Italian coach has had some form of success, and even in the 90s and 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you could see so many Italian coaches winning European trophies and sort of having that success on the continental scene that sort of inspired other European clubs to want a piece of that success. I personally believe the 2 big proponents of it were Real Madrid and Chelsea, who sort of elevated Italian coaching to this high level. Real Madrid obviously had Capello in the 90s, and they had a fair bit of success with him. He was known for his rigidity. He got a lot of criticism for his lack of flexibility in a way, but he still won them trophies in both his stints. And Chelsea, as we know, under Roman Abramovich, was almost having a fascination with Italian coaches. When Abramovich joined, they had Ranieri. He was there at the club when he joined. And eventually they had people like Ancelotti coming in, Conte coming in, Di Matteo won the Champions League with them, even though it was in a way accidental. So they've had their fair bit of success. And Italian coaches were known for their knowledge of the game. And as I mentioned, Coverciano it's a place of great intensity where coaches sort of learn how to be coaches and sort of bring that level of intensity to their coaching. The track record was enough for any club to want to employ them. And we can talk about the big European clubs, but Italian coaches are wanted everywhere in a way. They've in the past, I think Italian coaches have won trophies in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Russia, even, and Ukraine recently with Roberto De Zerbi and people like him. But there's always a demand for them for their success and their knowledge of the game.
The newer school of Italian coaching includes the likes of Luciano Spalletti, Maurizio Sarri, Gianpiero Gasperini, and Simone Inzaghi, among others. Do you think in time, tactically, they're also going to be recognized as trendsetters?
Potentially, I think it really depends on how the future works out for them. I do think that people like Spalletti, Gasperini, and Sarri, in a way, they're slightly older than the rest of the group. They're in their mid to late 60s, and they achieve success quite late. But I feel their reputation is already set in stone, as they have a very positive reputation. Spalletti, I feel, he's personally one of my favorite coaches because of how willing he is to take a risk in his game. We've seen over the last almost 2 decades now that he was one of the first great Italian coaches to employ the false nine and take that system to a new level. And even though he wasn't working with great clubs, sort of being more modest in his selection and where he worked, Serie A win in 2023 with Napoli was a very deserving honor for a coach that deserved it for so many years. So he sort of has his legacy set in stone, and it's a bit of a shame that it's now being sort of not tarnished, but sort of jigged around because of his relative failure with the national team. But I'm sure in time it'll be known that he is a legend of Italian football and deserves to be hailed as such. With the younger generation, I think that there is a greater recognition to want to be more attacking because that's how they recognize European football as being. In the 2000s, you could see the big five European leagues sort of changing away from what they were known as. English football was known for, having its long ball and hoof it up and head it into the net. But that changed the moment people like Guardiola and Arteta and Klopp and all that came through. Same for Klopp in Germany and German football as a whole, where they're more obsessed with pressing. And those two countries particularly, even Spain, who recognize their passing game, those three countries recognized that they needed to evolve. And Italy, in a way, was lacking behind in the 2000s. So these new coaches are a result of those changes back in the day in the 2000s when they were players. And they recognize that for Italian football to move forward, they have to either match or better what coaches abroad are doing. And they managed to do that. I think that Inzaghi is one of the best in Europe. De Zerbi's sort of had his bumps and he's proven to become a bit controversial, but he still has a very clear idea of what the game, should be played like, his ideas. Others even at Ajax, Francesco Farioli, who did very well in France with Nice, he's now being expected to be the guy that takes Ajax to the next level or back to the level they were at under Erik ten Hag. So there's loads of people who are changing the game and taking Italian football forward in a way. And that's a result of how European football changed over the last 20 years.
What's next on a pipeline for you?
For me personally, I'm tough to say at this point. I don't think I'm going to write another book for a while. I do enjoy football. I do have a job apart from writing about football that sort of takes up a lot of my time. And I enjoy that a lot. I think that I'm still a journalist. I do enjoy working in the industry, and it's a really fun industry to be in. I'm, again, very fortunate to have worked with the people I've been able to work with, very fortunate to have worked with the organizations I've been able to work with. So I'm grateful for that. I want to keep doing that on a regular basis and sort of work with newer, fresher journalists. So that's always an exciting part of being in this industry. But I've enjoyed writing stuff. I've enjoyed being an author, and I'm very grateful to a lot of people for that.
In closing, what is the legacy of Italian coaching philosophy in the history of football?
In my opinion, I think Italy has been the front runner for great football coaching. I think that no country has changed the game as much as they have. And that's not taking away from what people have done. So many countries have done. I think Germany and Spain and England have had such a big contribution to the game and how it's played. But Italians they are proactive in that sense. And it's a real shame that they aren't currently as active as they are in coaching to sort of elevate their players and give their players a chance. I do think Italian football has a lot of brilliant young talented footballers coming through that aren't sort of given the same path as their coaches are. But I don't think that the lack of recent World Cup success is a testament to how good they actually are in terms of coaching. In wider history, as I mentioned, they've changed the game more than anyone else. A lot of great coaches you think of in the history of the sport are Italian or have some sort of history with Italy. So yeah, that's put in a nutshell. That's what their standing is in world football.
With that, I would like to thank you in your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Tejwani's books are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, once again, thank you and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.